Life gets messy. Faith doesn't always feel steady. And sometimes the pain runs so deep, you wonder if God even sees you. If that's you, I see you. I've been there. And this show was created for people like us. We'll share the heartbreak, the flickers of hope, and the God who never walks away. This is Bare Faith, where raw faith and deep pain meet a relentless God.
Welcome back to Bare Faith in our series, Faith Beyond Letdowns. There's a moment many of us reach in life when we realize we are no longer asking God for help. We're asking Him for agreement. We have a picture in our mind of how things are supposed to unfold, and we keep praying as if it's God's job to make that picture real. Now, we'll call it faith, we'll call it hope, and we'll call it trusting God for the best. But underneath it, there's often something else at work. A quiet insistence, a fixed expectation, a belief that if we have been faithful enough, life should look a certain way by now. And this is where disappointment takes root, not because God has failed, but because reality refuses to cooperate with our script. Maybe the job didn't lead where we thought it would, or the relationship did not grow the way we planned, or maybe that really difficult season lasted way longer than we expected. Maybe nothing is falling apart, but nothing is landing where we aimed it either. And that tension just raises a hard question that we don't like to sit with. What happens when God is still good and still present and still working, and the outcome is not what we wanted it to be? What do we do when faith doesn't not change the circumstances, but instead asks us to change our grip? And today we're focusing on learning how to let go of how life should be. Not because expectations are wrong, but because clinging to them can keep us from trusting God as He actually is, not as we imagined Him He would be. So let's begin by naming the tension we carry when life refuses to follow our plan. Maybe it's a project at work that keeps hitting roadblocks, an important conversation that goes sideways, or that personal goal that just slips further from reach. Or maybe you followed the steps and gave it your all. Or maybe you know deep down you didn't give it your best effort, and stuff just isn't lining up the way you imagined it. And it shows up in everyday moments, that pause before you open your inbox, the way you just rearrange your schedule to make that one more thing work. Or maybe it's the quiet frustration that flares when someone else's decision disrupts your timeline. Maybe life hasn't collapsed, but it's not obeying. And that pressure, it's real. And people may not notice, but it shapes our choices and it clouds our clarity and it whispers that maybe we're just gripping too tight. Now, we might respond in all sorts of ways. We revise our plans, we hedge our bets, we push harder, or we just scroll through what we hope would reassure us. But that tension lingers, and we grow more impatient, and doubt grows, and there's that stubborn insistence that life should look a certain way. It's familiar and uncomfortable. And in those moments, we ask ourselves, am I steering my life? Or am I trusting God's plan? And naming it isn't about failure. It's about confessing sin. It's about noticing what control looks like in our lives, about recognizing how much energy we spend trying to shape our outcomes, even when the story isn't ours to direct. And once it's named, it opens the door, not to instant freedom, but to the first step of letting go and seeing what God is actually doing behind the scenes. But this tension like this, it rarely stays theoretical. It doesn't just live in our thoughts and prayers. It shows up in real lives, our schedules, and the moments when we realize how much we were depending on an outcome to validate our faith. And most of us don't recognize it right away because control disguises itself as responsibility, diligence, or perseverance. And we just keep moving, we keep adjusting, we keep trying to manage what feels just one decision away from everything working out. Until one moment makes it clear that no amount of effort can force life into the shape that we expected. And that's where a guy I know found himself. And I'm going to call him Sam. Sam had slapped his laptop shut, and he sank to his couch, and he stared at his empty inbox. The promotion he'd been working toward for months, every plan, every prayer, every extra hour wasn't his. Not even close. And he said, I gave everything, didn't I? And he kept replaying everything in his head. Did he miss something? Could I have pushed harder? Why isn't it mine? And even talking with me didn't help. The questions just kept circling relentlessly, and they kept gnawing at him. And each answer felt like a dead end. One morning, Sam was in the office, and he was just checking emails that he didn't need to. He kept rereading project updates because he thought if he could just stay in motion, that it would somehow fix what had already happened. And when he saw his colleagues step into decisions without him, the knot in his chest tightened. And every tiny movement in the office felt like a reminder that life wasn't bending to his plan. And one day he walked past the conference room and he caught a glimpse of the new team lead. And it was taking a meeting that he thought he would be directing. And a rush of frustration just hit him, almost like a physical shove. He said he could feel it in his jaw and his shoulders and his stomach. He said, this shouldn't feel like this. I did my part, I planned, I prepared. And why was it still not enough? And ultimately he realized he was exhausted, not from work, but from clinging so tightly to his version of how it should be. And every expectation he had made about how things should look was colliding with reality. And he caught himself daydreaming about alternate conversations he might have had, strategies he should have tried, or choices that he wished he would have made. And every time he just felt that tension rise again, like a wave threatening to sweep him under. And one evening, as he was doing the dishes, for the first time, he actually let himself sit with the disappointment instead of pushing it away. And he told God he didn't know how he was supposed to make this work. And why couldn't you just make it go the way I want it to? And he said the next morning he noticed something different, that he no longer had that same tight grip on every decision around him. And he was starting to see opportunities that he had been ignoring. And he realized he could influence some projects and he could support his colleagues and he could contribute meaningfully, even if it wasn't the outcome he had pictured. Letting go doesn't mean giving up. It meant releasing control and trusting God with the story. And though it took a while, Sam had taken a small step that felt huge. Instead of replaying what should have been, he sent a note of encouragement to the new team lead. He said it felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable, but it reminded him that his purpose didn't depend on the title or the recognition. And life didn't have to look the way he thought it should for God to still be at work. And that realization just lifted something heavy off of him. And in that surrender, Sam felt a shift. And even though all the tension didn't vanish, he was learning to lean into what it meant to let go and trust God and move forward, even when the story looked different from what he had imagined. And after hearing Sam's story, we can see a pattern many of us recognize. Life doesn't always unfold the way we expect. I mean, we try, we give our best, but the outcome, it still lands somewhere we didn't aim. And that tension is not only about disappointment, it's about control. It is the moment when effort no longer guarantees results and faith asks something deeper than hard work or good intentions. It asks us to release how we thought the story should go. And it is here that I want us to turn to Scripture to see how God works when surrender becomes unavoidable. The story of Gideon in Judges 6:7 speaks directly into the struggle of letting go of how it should be. And Gideon's story begins with hiding. He's threshing wheat in a wine press. He's trying to stay unnoticed and trying to protect what little he has left. He's not leading an army or shaping a vision for the future. He's just surviving. And it's there in that cramped, fearful space that the angel of the Lord appears and calls him Mighty Warrior. Now that name does not match Gideon's reality, and it does not fit how he sees himself or how he feels in life in that moment. And Gideon says, if the Lord is with us, then why has all of this happened? He is questioning God's method because he assumed God's presence should have produced a different outcome. And in that moment, Gideon is not wrestling with fear alone. He is wrestling with expectations, with the belief that if God were truly at work, things should have looked better by now. And even after God called him, Gideon kept testing him. He laid out the fleece, asking God to confirm his plan. First, wetting the fleece while the ground stayed dry, and then the opposite. Now, Gideon wasn't disobedient. He was just being human, and he needed some reassurance. But he also needed to release the way he thought things should happen and trust God's timing, trust God's methods, and God's strength over his own. And then God's instructions came. Take only 300 men to fight an army of thousands. Think about that. He was being asked to let go of strategy and numbers and everything that seemed logical. I'm sure every instinct screamed, this can't work. But God's ways are rarely what we expect. And Gideon obeyed. And he positioned his army with torches hidden in clay jars, and they had trumpets in their hand. And at God's command, they blew those trumpets, and they shattered the jars, and chaos erupted. The Midianites turned on each other, and victory came not through Gideon's plan, but through God's power working in the unexpected, in the places Gideon could not control. And this is the heart of letting go of how it should be. Like Sam, we can follow the steps, we can do our best, and still feel things slip out of our control. And Gideon shows us that trusting God means stepping forward, even when the outcome doesn't match the expectations, and even when the fear is so loud and logic is telling us to retreat. But step by step, we trust and we obey and we release control. Now, Gideon, he didn't start confident, and he just didn't leap into obedience with certainty. He just moved forward one step at a time, trusting God's way over his own. And that's what letting go looks like in real life. Just small acts of courage, faith in the unseen, and surrendering what we think should happen so God's plan can unfold. And Romans 8:28 reminds us, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. This verse is not promising that life will always go the way we hoped. And it's not about God fixing every circumstance to match our expectations. Instead, it confronts the heart that struggles to release control. Even when plans stall or timelines stretch or outcomes aren't what we imagined, God is at work. He's shaping what is unseen, and he's aligning events and orchestrating the story according to his purpose and not ours. And sometimes the real obstacle isn't hardship itself, but our refusal to let go of what we thought should happen. And the Romans verse calls us into surrender, not rescue. It invites us to trust God when life is different from what we planned, to release the tension of our expectation, and to believe that he is working all things toward his good design. And Scripture shows us that God is at work even when our outcomes don't match expectations. So now the question becomes practical and personal. How do we actually live this kind of surrender when life just keeps unfolding differently than we had planned? Here are 3 ways to live in uncertainty while staying anchored in God. Option 1, step forward. Trust often begins with action, not emotion. Gideon didn't feel ready. He doubted himself. He even asked God for proof more than once. But he moved anyway, small steps, following God's instructions, even when fear and uncertainty screamed louder than hope. And you can do the same. Just start with something tangible. Maybe that conversation you've been avoiding, or that prayer you've been postponing. A step toward a goal that feels impossible. It doesn't have to be perfect. The act of obedience invites God's presence and shifts your perspective from what you wish life looked like to what God is actually doing. Option 2, reevaluate expectations. Letting go of how it should be often means asking, do I need to control the outcome? Or am I holding on to a version of life that isn't God's plan? Like Gideon's army shrinking to 300 men, God sometimes calls us to release what feels necessary so he can accomplish something greater. So take a moment to write down your expectations, your career goals, your relationship goals. Maybe it's family or personal growth. And ask God to show you where he is asking for you to trust over control. Releasing your group doesn't mean giving up. It means trading your timeline and vision for God's guidance and strength. Option 3, notice God's work. It's easy for us to overlook the ways God is moving when results don't match our plans. Gideon couldn't see the Midianite camp's confusion, but God's plan was already unfolding. And sometimes the victories are invisible at first. Doors open quietly. Hearts start to soften. Lessons are learned in private, and courage starts to grow in fear. Make it a practice to notice God's subtle work. Journaling small moments, praising him for unseen progress, or reflecting on past instances where God turned what seemed hopeless into victory will train your eyes to see how his hand is in the unexpected. So we have 3 ways to live it. Choose one practice to focus on this week that meets you where you are. First, step forward anyway. Take action even when fear is screaming. 2, reevaluate your expectations. Let God redefine the outcome. 3rd, celebrate God's unseen work. Notice his movement even when it's hidden. These steps aren't shortcuts to understanding everything or controlling life. They're ways to live in trust and courage and obedience, learning to let go of how life should be and stepping into the freedom of how God actually works. Before we close, let's take a moment to see how Christ walks with us. Jesus doesn't wait for our lives to be neat, for our hearts to be perfect, or for our pain to disappear before he shows up. He steps right into the spaces where life is messy, where hope feels fragile, and where we're struggling to let go of how things should be. Think of the Syrophoenician woman. She was desperate, standing outside the doors of Jesus' presence. She was overlooked by society. She was just a mother pleading for her daughter's healing. And at first it seemed Jesus ignored her, but she persisted. She didn't demand perfection, and she didn't have it all figured out. She simply brought her need, her trust, and her hope to him. And Jesus met her exactly there, honoring her faith and giving her what she had sought. Because sometimes following God doesn't look like ease or instant resolution. It looks like persistence in the midst of doubt, fear, or invisibility. Then there's Zacchaeus, a man despised, labeled a sinner, and living in isolation and shame. But Jesus noticed him and called him by name and stepped into his life. And he didn't wait for Zacchaeus to fix everything first. Christ simply entered his world and met him in the awkward, the overlooked, the unexpected, and transformed him from the inside out. And God meets us in the spaces we never thought were redeemable, the part of our hearts we thought that were too small or too hidden or too broken. And consider the woman caught in adultery. She faced public humiliation, fear, and judgment. She may have expected condemnation, but instead Jesus showed her grace, and he protected her dignity and gave her hope. In John 8:11, he said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." God doesn't erase our reality or the consequences we face, but he meets us tenderly in it, giving us courage to move forward differently with his presence leading the way. Here's the truth. Christ doesn't wait for our hearts to be fully ready, or for our lives to line up perfectly, or for our plans to match his. He meets us in the tension and the disappointment, the fear and the mess. And he walks beside us as we learn to release control and as we let go of how it should be and trust him instead. His presence is not a distant promise here. He is with us in the cracks and the margins and the tender spaces of our lives. None of us are alone, and he is shaping endurance, hope, and trust gently, faithfully, and powerfully. If today's episode stirred something in your heart, I want to invite you to something deeper. My new devotional, Chasing Emptiness, Finding Fullness, has released. In over 45 days, it walks through scripture, reflection, and journaling, creating space to sit with God and what's unfinished, and to let him meet you there. If you scan the QR code, it will take you straight to the link where you can grab your copy. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you come back next week as we discuss faith that holds.